Um, to those of you that have just joined us, welcome to our event tonight. We are Die Linke Internationals, or the working group of Die Linke in Berlin. And today we're going to be talking about it's 10 years since the North African revolutions, and we are very honored and pleased that tonight we have Hossam el-Hamalawy with us to tell you about what was happening at the time and what's going on now. And Hossam is a journalist, a photographer, and an activist with the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists. He was among the Jan 25 organizers and continues to report dissent at arabawi.org. And we are really, very pleased that he has been able to take the time to talk to us about what's going on and what's been happening, because, of course, there's not been as much coverage of what's going on in Egypt in the last few years, but luckily we're able to talk about it again now that we have the 10th anniversary of the so-called Arab Spring. And that we're going to jump in straight with questions, and that actually leads me to my first question, or our first question, which is if you could tell us, Hossam, how accurate you actually find the term Arab Spring as a description of what happened 10 years ago.
Hello, Hannah, and thanks again for having me in this event and giving me a platform to speak. Regarding your question, I use the term only out of convenience because that's the popular term, and usually when you say it, everyone knows what you're referring to. But to be honest, it's not that accurate because the term Arab Spring does not engulf completely all the groups that went on an uprising in 2011. There were many, the region is full of diverse ethnic and cultural minorities and groups, and they took part in the revolt, and they don't necessarily categorize themselves as Arabs. And on several occasions in the past, the idea of Arabism was used against them in one form or another in order to achieve some sort of a racist social control in their societies. So, for example, I mean, we have the Kurds. The Kurds are not Arabs, but they were part of that wave of revolt. So I usually refer to it as regional uprisings, the 2011 first wave of Middle Eastern uprisings. But I don't use the term that much except like out of convenience.
Great. So, I mean, oh, sorry, Phil, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was going to say that that's really very interesting. And actually, you already touched on the fact that there were so many groups that took part in this uprising at the time. And but maybe we can kind of go into directly your experience of what happened 10 years ago, because I know you were there and you're reporting from Tahrir Square. So maybe you could talk to us a bit about the background and your personal experience.
I've been involved in the Egyptian opposition since I was a student in my undergraduate years. I joined the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists in 1998 when I was at my third year at university. So I've been involved in the dissident scene for a long time before the revolt. And I consider myself to be fortunate because I saw incrementally how dissent was accumulating and how the road to revolt was being paved years in advance, when everyone back then thought that you were crazy to talk about some form of collective mass action in the future. By January 2011, around the time of the uprising, there was some contradictory general feeling. I mean, on the one hand, anyone could feel that Egypt was heading for an explosion. I already had several blog posts in 2010, for example, where I was talking about the future, and the summary, of what I wrote, so as not to take a long time, is that basically we're heading for an uprising. And this does not necessarily happen because I could see into the future, but I think this was a general observation of anyone who lived in Egypt at the time. You had strikes in literally every single sector in Egyptian society. You had wide disillusionment with the regime's economic policies. In Egypt, we went on an aggressive neoliberal program starting from 1991, 1992. And by the time of the uprising, although Egypt was being celebrated as a success model for the IMF and the World Bank, the situation on the ground was definitely in a much horrible status. And impoverishment and class polarization were accelerating. There was also a wide sense of anger vis-a-vis the police in Egypt. Egypt is a police state. That's hardly news. But I don't think that non-Egyptians at the time understood the level of brutality that the police was involved in micromanaging the daily affairs of the Egyptians. The stereotype, of police violence usually is that, police is violent towards political activists. But you will be surprised that this is not necessarily always the case. At least in the case of the political activists, sometimes the police put some considerations that, these guys are experienced and they might, after they leave custody, they're going to speak about it, they're going to make a fuss about it, they're going to expose what's happening, blah, blah, blah. So actually the police on some occasions used to treat us a little bit leniently, but not always. But in the case of the average Egyptian citizen on a daily basis, it was any contact with the police was extremely humiliating. And the way that Mubarak policed the country was very similar to a foreign occupation army engaged in pacifying the local population. You used to have police cars that would go on patrol at night in working class neighborhoods and in the neighborhoods of the urban poor. And then they would pick young men, randomly, rough them up, beat them up. If they have any unsolved crimes, they can just randomly choose people and give them, those accusations and fabricate charges against them. They used to impose royalty like any gang cartel, basically. So the police was another reason that there was wide anger in the public. All of these factors were basically getting together. And in the midst of this, the revolution happened in Tunisia, and it was aired live to millions of Egyptians in their homes. And this kind of basically put out a simple message. It's not crazy to have a revolution. Revolutions work. Your Arab dictators are not invincible. And look at Ben Ali, he's been toppled. So if the Tunisians can topple Ben Ali, then we can topple Mubarak too. And this was among the sparks that led to the January revolt. It might have longer roots, but definitely the uprising in Tunisia was the spark for ours.
Before the next question, just to anybody watching this on the leftberlin.com, you can ask questions. There's a button bottom right saying ask a question. If you send it in, we'll try and put them to Hossam. I just want to ask Hossam next, who was it who made the revolution? Reading some of the Western reports, you get the idea a couple of people sat on Facebook, they typed some things in and suddenly there were 2 million people in Tahrir Square. But what was it that moved from this general state of repression to 25th of January and beyond?
In the run-up to the January 25th protests, there were several organizational meetings that took place in order to coordinate the actions on that day. The revolution was not largely spontaneous. Spontaneity is one factor in any political action, and but at the same time, in order to have a successful uprising, you need some level of organization and coordination. Spontaneity is not enough. And in the case of the January Revolution, to be specific, since that's what we're talking about tonight, there were several coordinating meetings between the political Egyptian opposition forces of all streams except Islamists. The Islamists were not initial participants in the uprising. And actually, the Muslim Brotherhood leadership prior to January 25th had declared that they are not going to take part in the protests. But other organizers from the left-wing groups, including my group, the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists, as well as Nasserists, and as well as other political factions, we got together, we agreed on a set of demands. The highest ceiling at the time in the beginning was not the overthrow of the regime, but it was simply the impeachment of the interior minister, Habib al-Adli, as well as the demand for stopping immediately police torture and investigating torture cases. But as the events progressed, spontaneity played a role, and the reaction of the Egyptian people to the calls of the protests on January 25th took everyone by surprise, including the organizers themselves. I remember on that day, I was playing a logistical role, basically. I was among the army of Egyptian bloggers who were tasked with disseminating those visuals of the protests and updates to the widest circle possible among local and international journalists and activists. So after the police dispersed brutally, like the first wave of protests, by the evening, when I started receiving phone calls from colleagues like saying, Hossam, there is 1 million people in Tahrir Square. I was like, I mean, are you out of your mind? Are you smoking something? I mean, this can be like, what do you mean? I mean, I know activists are usually in the habit of inflating numbers, but, not to that extent. Come on. And they were like, no, there is roughly at least 500,000 people in Tahrir Square. And when the visuals started coming in, I was like, oh my God, this is bigger than anything I've ever seen in my whole life in Egypt at the time. And if we manage to sustain the mobilization at least till Friday, 3 days later, I meant, then we can start talking about a serious overthrow of the regime is underway.
So you say it was a surprise to you how many people turned up. So can you tell us a bit about how it came to the fact that so many people did turn up on that particular day?
It might sound very simplistic now, when I say that, there was a call for protests, some people showed up, and then suddenly it snowballed. This might sound like, very simple, and it was that simple. But I think the complications or the other side of the story that tells you how complicated was that process is if you go back in time, for example, in the 1990s or the beginning of the 2000s, and you would tell someone, let's have a protest against Hosni Mubarak, he would tell you that you're mad. This would be something extremely suicidal. In the 1990s, Egypt was going through a dirty war under the guise of a war on terror, whereby dissent was crushed from all shades, not just the Islamists. Industrial actions were a rare phenomena. Industrial struggles were at their lowest. Social struggles were at their lowest. The student movement was confined within the walls of the universities. Once you stepped outside, you were risking being shot by the police. So it was a long process of basically dissent and anger accumulating, starting from the year 2000, to be more specific, that led to the fact that by the time you reach January 25th, 2011, the Egyptian public was like a bomb waiting to explode. The fear from the regime had dwindled. The fear from the police had dwindled. Disillusionment with Mubarak, was very widespread. And there were also an increasingly, like the masses were learning. I mean, the masses were reaching political maturity. All of these struggles that were happening in Egypt in the 10 years prior to the 2011 uprising meant that there was some collective consciousness that understood slogans, that understood how you would organize. So even when people started acting spontaneously on that day and throughout the 18 days of the uprising, this spontaneity did not come from another universe. It came from the struggles that they had went through or that they have seen with their own eyes in the years in the run-up to 2011. So that's what brought everyone together in the end during the uprising.
Can we move on to the role of the Muslim Brotherhood? You said at the beginning the Brotherhood wasn't really part of the organising, and indeed it was quite hostile to some of the first actions, and yet very quickly came to play quite a leading role in the actions after 25th of January. How did that happen and why?
The role of the Muslim Brotherhood was contradictory, and this is in general the kind of contradictions that you would expect from the Islamists, and you would expect from any political movement that is multi-class when it comes to its nature. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Muslim Brotherhood is not one unified bloc in the end. When I was telling you that the leadership that the Muslim Brotherhood did not endorse initially the call for protests, I made sure to specify that it was the Muslim Brotherhood leadership that did not want to endorse the protests. But from day one, believe it or not, there were young Muslim Brotherhood activists who took part in the protests against the will of their political leaders. And such contradictions in the organizations where the leadership is in one universe while the base cadres are in another universe or on another front is a phenomena that has marked the history of Islamism in general. Again, why is that? When you get an organization or a movement whose leadership, they come from the elites, they come from sections of the ruling class at the end of the day. They could be run by billionaires. They could be run by large landowners who are conservatives. So people like Khairat Shater, for example, who was the main organizer and the political leadership of the group, the real political leadership. And right now he's in prison. Now he's a millionaire. There were other also businessmen. But if you go down, the bulk of the organization, they come from middle-class backgrounds, people who are like doctors, pharmacists, engineers, graduates, clerics. And then they also, at the bottom, they have membership that comes from working-class backgrounds, peasantry, and some of the urban poor. The Muslim Brotherhood throughout its history was not known to be a working class organization, but they did have some roots in the working class. Now, what does this mean in terms of practice? This means that when the Muslim Brotherhood raises the slogan of, we want to implement the Islamic Sharia, for example. Now, slogans are very catchy. And of course, they can mobilize millions around those slogans. But then when you ask them to be a little bit more detailed and explain to us concretely, what do you mean by applying Sharia? Maybe someone like Khairat Shater, for him, Sharia would be neoliberal reforms, would be free trade, would be stability and crushing strikes for the sake of the country not devolving into chaos. It might mean a package of policies that actually, if you ask a base cadre from the Muslim Brotherhood, who might be a factory worker, for example, so you want to apply Sharia, what's Sharia for you? He will answer you back by Sharia is social justice. Sharia is that, I would get job security. Sharia is that I would have decent housing and that my children would get decent education. Sharia is this and that. And he would give you some form of a welfare state that is not different really from what social democrats, might put forward. Now, this means that at every twist and turn of the Egyptian revolution, and even prior to the revolution, that whenever the Muslim Brotherhood took a concrete position regarding a cause or regarding a political event, you always had fractures and cracks and splits within the organization, because you cannot come up with a political program that would satisfy every single one in the organization. Hence, people like me on the left, prior to the revolution, we were using, slogans like, the best way to expose reformists is by putting them in power. And actually, throughout this year, when the Muslim Brotherhood had the presidency, I would say this was the year where the biggest splits in the organizations were happening, where the Muslim Brotherhood were put in a position where they had to deliver promises, populist promises that they were giving, but instead they were acting in a very neoliberal fashion. So again, the Muslim Brotherhood did not initially endorse the uprising, but their cadres were part of it. Throughout the 18 days until Mubarak stepped down, they were doing a contradictory dual thing. Their leadership was trying to negotiate a compromise with Hosni Mubarak and with Omar Suleiman, who was his spy chief. But at the same time, their cadres were in Tahrir Square, and they defied the orders to suspend the protests at least on one occasion throughout the 18 days. And they fought bravely and heroically throughout the uprising. Now, after Mubarak was toppled, the military and the Islamist forces in general, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but that will also include most of the Salafis in Egypt, they got into some Faustian deal with the military. Like, we will try to keep the streets as calm as possible. We will try to diffuse the militancy in the streets as much as possible. And in exchange, we will embark on a political process that will give us what we think is our deserved share of the political cake as the Egyptian opposition. So this meant that the Muslim Brotherhood was attacking strikers following the overthrow of Mubarak. It was using anti-revolutionary rhetoric against any mobilizations against the military throughout 2011 and 2012. They are the ones who defended the police, for example, when they started attacking us during the November and the December 2011 mini uprisings in what was dubbed as the Muhammad Mahmoud Street uprising. It was the late President Morsi himself who appointed Sisi as the Minister of Defense, and he's the one who refused to hold the military generals accountable for their crimes throughout 2011. He's the one who increased the finances of the police forces and rearmed them again after they were defeated during the uprising. And it's ironically the same arms that they used to massacre his supporters in the end. So as you can see, it was a dual kind of role throughout the uprising. But what is scandalous is the position of most of the left-wing forces during the Egyptian revolution, because the Egyptian Stalinist left, as well as the nationalist left, they have this analysis of Islamism as fascism, which is definitely wrong. The Islamists are not fascists. This means that this does not mean that they are progressive, but fascism distinctively is a social movement with a definite characters and traits that's different from the Muslim Brotherhood. So for them, since these were fascists, they stood by the military counter-revolution in its fight against the Islamists. So the Egyptian left supported the biggest massacres in the history of modern Egypt, which happened in August 2013, because the military was fighting fascism. In the name of confronting fascism, the Egyptian left sections of it also stood by Ahmad Shafiq during the second round of the presidential elections in 2012, when he ran against Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they were willing to go as far as supporting the official representative of the counter-revolution, anything but to get the Islamists in power. So that's, in summary, the role of Islamism and the role of the other political forces vis-a-vis Islamism throughout the Egyptian uprising.
Thank you for that. That was very comprehensive and really fascinating. And actually, you've been talking a lot about contradictions and duality just now, and you've also been talking about the army. So that really leads us really nicely to our first audience question. And I'll just do a little tangent that anybody who's listening, you're very welcome to send in questions, and we will put them to Hossam. But the question we have is from Miguel in Berlin, who says, did you manage to win any part of the then army to the revolution, and was this even possible?
That's a very good question. And I think this is the question that will determine in the future the fate of any revolution. Can you win over the army to your side or not? And by winning over the army, I don't mean appeasing the military generals who run the army and who are essentially part of the ruling regime. And actually, they are not just part of the ruling regime, they are the last line of defense for the state in any society. The only reason that the military generals did not nuke us in Tahrir in 2011 was the fact that they were not sure about maintaining the ranks and keeping the loyalty of the young officers and the conscripts if they ordered them to open fire on the protesters. That's the number one reason. I know that there are tons of conspiracy theories about how the military actually wanted to get rid of Mubarak. That's why they allowed those Tahrir protesters to do their thing. This is completely untrue. Those hand-picked military generals, no matter how dissatisfied they were with Mubarak over X issue or Y issue, they never dreamt of going against him at the end of the day. But the only reason that they did not fire on us throughout the 18 days was the fact that they did not trust their soldiers to implement those orders. Now, this changed later. It took the army 3 years to re-establish its control over its ranks, over its military officers, over its ground troops, over its conscripts, so as to be able to relaunch the attack, the real attack against the revolution following the coup in 2013. Although the army, already before was involved in several attacks on protesters. There was at least one reported mutiny at some point throughout those 3 years until we reached the coup. And when it comes to the ranks of the central security forces, these are the police paramilitaries. That's the army of the Interior Ministry. And it's the equivalent of the riot troops in the West. But in Egypt, they are highly militarized. And since the beginning of the 1970s, they were the main tool for controlling crowds and for crushing dissent in Egypt. But they depend on conscripts. They don't depend on like full-time soldiers. So these conscripts actually went on several mutinies throughout the revolution. Now, how did revolutionaries relate to this? I don't think that they have related necessarily in the correct manner, but at the same time, there wasn't much to be done, and I will explain myself. On the one hand, there were sections of the Egyptian opposition that got completely freaked out by the prospects that the army might split or that mutinies might happen. And so they, from the start, were for preserving the army as an institution that is completely solid and with no fractures. How are they going to do that while Mubarak's generals are on top of it? You know, they had all of these naive ideas that they could give them safe exit, that maybe we will compromise with, you know, some of their privileges, but we'll keep the army as it is. And of course, you know, we see where did this take us in the end. But on the one hand, even revolutionary radicals, including myself and others on the left, in order to be able to relate to those conscripts, you have to be big enough to present them with an alternative. A soldier might be disillusioned with his command. A soldier might be dissatisfied with the orders he's given, but he's not gonna simply lay down his weapons and join the protesters unless the protesters can protect him, unless the protesters can provide him with an umbrella that can shield him from the wrath of the army. If he would feel that if he crosses over to the other side, that the other side is winning. These are things that, I mean, it's one thing to read about a revolution, and it's another thing to be in the midst of a revolution. And you have to always keep on trying to evaluate and judge the psyche and the mood of the masses and the mood of your enemies as you are dealing with them. So I hope this answers your question somehow. I mean, this can take us tons of hours and volumes of books, you know, I mean, to write about and read about. But I try to be as brief as possible.
Thanks, Hossam. The next question is from Talia in the UK. Now, I'll do this in two parts because there's quite a lot for you to get your teeth into. The first is about the Egyptian diaspora. Talia says, many thanks, Hossam and the Left Berlin, for this rich and thought-provoking account of the Egyptian uprising. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts regarding the possibilities of an emerging political alternative in Egypt, given the unprecedented consolidation of authoritarian power and the absence of the generation that developed first-hand political experience pre- and post-2011 due to detention or forced exile. I would also appreciate your thoughts on whether and or how Egyptian diaspora can contribute structurally to forms of political change in Egypt.
You know, I will repeat what I always say, you know, when counter-revolutions are victorious, they don't take you back to square one. They take you back to square zero or even below zero. Things do not return to what they were on the eve of a revolution. So what our comrade here has asked is definitely a spot-on question. The regime or the counter-revolutionary regime in Egypt has consolidated power and has shut down any margin and any public free space where you can organize. Independent unions have been crushed. Political parties are besieged. 19 new prisons at least have been built since the coup up until today to house tens of thousands of political prisoners, or at least 60,000 political prisoners, according to the estimates of local and international rights watchdogs. Most of the community organizers, youth revolutionary movements, all of this has been crushed. But things cannot continue like this forever. What I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, there are spontaneous protests that are happening every now and then, here and there. I mean, the protests have not stopped since the coup, but they are usually protests that do not involve political actors. They are spontaneous protests over gentrification, housing issues, wildcat strikes from state enterprises that are about to be liquidated or privatized. And you know, these like little struggles are erupting here and there. What, in my view, the revival of the Egyptian revolutionary upheavals, or the revival of street politics, will have to go hand in hand with rebuilding what has been destroyed from the political structures of the Egyptian dissident community, because it's those structures that can sustain a mobilization for long periods of time. And it's those structures that will be able to translate the spontaneity of the masses into articulating political demands and political programs, and provide a viable alternative to the regime. This is not going to happen anytime soon, I'm afraid. I have to be very, very realistic about how bleak the situation is, but I am for trying to push the ceiling and to push the red lines bit by bit, by united fronts with very low ceilings that do not necessarily call for the overthrowing of the military regime right now, but to have smaller fights to try to gain a little bit of a political margin, where in the future you can start mobilizing and getting more active in that margin that you will win bit by bit. And on the other hand, the Egyptians in the diaspora will have to play a bigger role, obviously, than the ones back home in the current time, until the balance of forces start to change in the future. What can Egyptians in the diaspora do? They can do many things. I mean, the number one priority, of course, is the solidarity campaigns with the Egyptian detainees. It's not a secret that, you know, there are draconian restrictions over the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech in Egypt now. And social media users, journalists, bloggers, I mean, everyone is targeted. So at least we can be their voice for now, where we can disseminate information about the detainees, where we can make so much noise, as much as possible, on social media and among the local media in the countries where we are currently based. So here, for example, if I'm in Germany, I should try to raise the issue of Egypt as much as I can within the German media establishment and among the political circles. And in addition to that is to try to lobby your governments respectively, where in the countries where you're currently residing in exile, into stopping as much as possible the military and the security cooperation with the Sisi regime. These two things, at least they are campaigns that are like very natural, you know, I mean, things to do in the beginning. And from these campaigns in the future, we can start developing some united fronts that can present a different political alternative to the regime. I know there has been already several initiatives in the past, but in general, I find them more of, I'm not trying to dismiss them, but it's almost a circus. It's not, because there is nothing really that you can do back home at the moment. There isn't any space for you to move. And the opposition abroad has been doing all of these quixotic calls for strikes and protests and uprisings, things that did not deliver and will not deliver anytime soon. So there isn't anything that's concretely viable as an alternative at the moment. But I believe this will evolve out of the campaigns that we are currently involved in.
Okay, you've slightly anticipated Talia's final question, which is, how do you see the current wave of labor mobilization in Egypt?
It is, of course, different from the years 2006 till 2011. These were the years that preceded the January uprising. And these were the years that the labor movement was being revived. And you feel that it was gaining ground, it was spreading, it was much more optimistic and hopeful and much more confident that they will achieve victory over the different campaigns that they were involved in. The current struggles that are taking place in Egypt, I mean, there are several strikes and labor protests that are happening, by the way, as I'm speaking. I mean, there was the one in Talha, which is located in the Daqahliya province in the Nile Delta, where, for example, workers were striking against the privatization of the firm and its liquidation. Another strike was happening in Hilwan, where our famous steel mills that enjoyed an iconic status in Egyptian political culture, as well as in the labor movement, now they were being liquidated. So the workers were going on strike against it. These are more or less like desperate struggles to try to defend whatever gains left or whatever minimal rights left. It's different from the kind of struggles in the past where you are actually going on an offense, trying to gain more rights that are, of course, well-deserved for the workers. So more or less, it is, of course, a positive sign that the labor movement is trying to fight back as much as possible. But at the same time, it's a very depressing scene, whereby independent unions have been crushed already, where the labor activist networks have been, decimated a long time ago. And the strikes that are happening are not the kind of strikes where you can go to other factories and try to agitate the workers into going on solidarity industrial actions. I mean, it is a time of retreat. Now, will this continue forever? No, I believe not. The struggle always goes through cycles where you have an industrial upturn and then an industrial downturn, industrial upturn, industrial downturn. And the same also would go for social struggles and everything else. So I think people like myself and like, the comrade who asked the question, or any of the viewers, we should try to do our best to publicize the strikes that are happening in Egypt, to try to gear up solidarity, solidarity letters and solidarity statements from international trade unions, for example, with the struggle. But we have to be realistic about the ceiling that those strikes have, so as not to take any miscalculated moves about the potential in front of us. These are very risky times. This is a very paranoid and a counter-revolutionary regime. And one miscalculation can lead to very drastic results in terms of people's lives. So we have to be a little bit cautious when we are organizing.
Thank you so much for that very in-depth answer. That was very interesting, both hopeful and scary. I have a question. You've talked a lot about the role of many different groups and kind of the role and position within what happened 10 years ago and what's been happening since then. And we haven't really heard much about the role of women. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
It's not a secret, of course, that Egypt is a very sexist country where women are in a very discriminated and marginalized status in general. Egypt is one of the most notorious countries where there is sexual harassment, for example, for women in the streets. But this was also weaponized against political dissidents years before the revolution. For example, on the 25th of May 2005, the regime of Hosni Mubarak organized sex assaults against women protesters and women journalists in downtown Cairo in broad daylight on a day where there was a constitutional referendum. And this started a trend among the security services to use that weapon very much. But despite the sexism and despite the sexual harassment and all the other problems facing Egyptian women, if you look at the strike wave in the years in the run-up to the revolution, you will find that women played a central role in the strike wave. Actually, the strike wave itself was initiated by 3,000 female garment workers who went on strike in December 2006 in the city of Mahalla, which is located in the heart of the Nile Delta. And they struck over, some unfulfilled government promises of paying like bonuses. It was a bread and butter issue. But they started to chant, "الرجالة فين الحريمة هم?" Where are the men? Here we are the women. And they shamed their male colleagues into action. And that's when the entire textile mill went on strike. And after it won, it triggered the winter of labor discontent, where mass strikes were happening in the textile sector, in the transport sector, in the aviation. I mean, everywhere there were strikes. So as you can see, the gender roles were being challenged already in the years in the run-up to the revolution. Throughout the 18 days, I mean, women were part of the Tahrir protesters. They were part of the Tahrir sit-in. They were part of the human shields that were that slept in front of the army tanks to prevent them from suspending the protests. But this does not mean that their situation suddenly became rosy after the toppling of Mubarak. Because, for example, the first women's march that was organized on the 8th of March, 2011, the march was mobbed by conservative members of the public, which could be dated back to the year 2000 with the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada. That event was like a rock in still water and helped revive street politics and revive campus activism in a way that started a chain reaction that led to the 2011 uprising. Number two is that many of the revolution organizers, their roots, they all go back to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Egypt. Number three is that one of the main reasons, and it wasn't a secondary reason, that Egyptians were extremely upset with their autocrat was not simply because of what he was doing in Egypt only, but also because of his foreign policy, because he was a loyal servant for the Americans, because he was protecting the state of Israel, because he was securing the oil supplies to the West, because we were adopting a foreign policy that did not endorse Palestinian rights and support the resistance. And if you look at the 18 days, you will find that Tahrir was full of slogans that accused Hosni Mubarak and Omar Suleiman, his spy chief, of being agents of Israel, of being agents of Zionism, of being agents of imperialism. There were banners that were calling for cutting the gas supplies to Israel. There were Palestinian flags, obviously, in Tahrir Square. And there were several protests later, after the 18 days, in Tahrir, in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance. And I think at least on two occasions, not just one, the Israeli embassy itself was stormed by the Egyptian revolutionaries who were against having any sort of diplomatic or economic ties with the Zionist state. So Palestine was central, and hence you can also understand the vengeance or the brutal and aggressive attitude of Sisi towards Palestinians. It's not just because of the simplistic reason that Sisi regards Hamas as Ikhwan, as the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. It's not as simple as that. It's mainly because when you get a counter-revolution, the counter-revolution attacks all the gains of the revolution, but also attacks all what the revolution stood for. So the revolution stood for Palestine. The revolution stood in solidarity with the Palestinians. Hence, Gaza and Palestine in general for Sisi is a nightmare. It's a radicalizing factor. It's a factor that emboldens Egyptians to revolt. So that's like in regards to Palestine.
Thank you so much for that, and we're really sorry again for the technical problem. We've hopefully now informed everybody that this has happened. We don't want to keep you too long because obviously you're talking just you, but there was something that I think we haven't really talked about so much yet, but I think it's really interesting and will hopefully also lead us towards kind of talking about what's going on now and a slight comparison with the uprisings of the last kind of year and a bit. Or 2 years now, I guess, is that I wanted to hear your perspective. This is, of course, you're a journalist yourself, what your perspective on the use of the media and social media was at the time. And because, it's been, the Arab Spring or the Arab revolutions from 10 years ago were described as, the Facebook revolution in some ways. And I just thought maybe you could tell us a bit more about how that was used to organize. And then if you have any insight about how that kind of developed in the last 10 years, especially with the other uprisings that have been happening around the region.
On the eve of the revolution in 2011, it was a minority of Egyptians who had cyber access or access to social media. But at the same time, the Egyptian blogosphere in general has been creating so much buzz starting from 2005. And bloggers, as well as what became to be known as Facebook activists or social media activists, were part of the dissident movement in the run-up to the revolution. But it's important to understand the dynamics that governed the strength of the Egyptian blogs and the Egyptian social media in general, so as to not to exaggerate or to dismiss their power and their role in the revolt later. The power of the Egyptian blogosphere and social media users stemmed from the fact that there was an unofficial marriage between old media and new media. Our blogs were not followed by millions of Egyptians. Our Facebook pages and Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts were not followed by millions of Egyptians or outside even Egypt directly. But there were a great number of journalists, whether it's from the private media, the newspapers that were owned by businessmen in Egypt, and who enjoyed relatively, prior to the revolution, a bigger or a higher ceiling in terms of the freedom of press vis-a-vis the state-run media. It was the satellite television channels like Al Jazeera and others who were closely following our blogs and our Facebook pages, and they were reporting on them to their audience. So whatever I write on my Twitter account, which on the eve of the uprising was only followed by a few hundred users, no more than 1,000, would reach actually millions of viewers in Egypt and outside if Al Jazeera decides to report on one of my tweets, for example. So I'm not trying to dismiss the importance of the blogosphere and the online media or the alternative media in Egypt in the run-up to the revolution. Because, for example, I mean, they took a much more braver stand vis-a-vis police brutality. They themselves were the subject of torture and crackdowns from the security services. They helped to raise the issue of sexual harassment and women's oppression, as well as causes related to the queer community in Egypt and other issues that were big taboo. So they helped to push those taboos and to push the ceiling even higher. But at the same time, it wasn't just on their own. It was because there was some sort of dependency, a mutual dependency between them and the old media. Now, these dynamics, they still exist. I mean, obviously, every single satellite channel, I mean, they follow now Twitter and they follow Facebook and they follow some of the main activist websites, and they continue to report on them to millions of spectators beyond the tiny circles of the activist community. But at the same time, the level of dependence, I would say, decreased a little bit. And this is largely because of the spread of the scope of social media in Egypt and elsewhere. I mean, today, for example, you have at least 42 million Egyptians out of 100 million who are on Facebook. That's almost like half of the population. So this means that even if Al Jazeera or even if this newspaper or that newspaper did not report on what you write on social media, there are still channels for you to spread the word and to get the visuals of what's happening to a wider audience other than what you had prior to 2011. So this is one thing. The other thing that I also need to maybe highlight and clarify, we did not use social media as organizing tools. Most of the events, the important events at least, that happened throughout the revolution and prior to the revolution included us, even as social media activists, if you want to call us that, you know, or call us bloggers or call us whatever. I mean, many of us, we were already part of existing political movements on the ground. We were already engaged in organizing on the ground. And most of the events that we organized, we actually did meet face to face in order to agree on them and to agree on the marches, the routes, the slogans, the banners. But we used social media tools in order to publicize and amplify what we were doing on the ground at the end of the day. So just to sum up, I mean, to give you like one final example, from the years of 2004 till 2006, these are the Kifaya years. Kifaya is Arabic for enough. And Kifaya is the umbrella movement that was the pro-democracy movement against Mubarak and his family. Most of the Kifaya protests did not include more than 24 protesters, or, you know, sometimes few hundreds. And if you're lucky, you can get a couple of thousands. But at the same time, we made sure that the visuals that we snap and we take in these small protests are disseminated to Al Jazeera and to the other social and to the other satellite channels, as well as on our blogs and our social media tools, so that millions outside us would see the actions of this small minority of Egyptians and embolden them to follow suit. And that's how we created the domino effect at the end of the day.
Yeah, speaking of social media, we have had our own technical problems this evening, which have been solved now. I'm not sure if it helps the people who are watching live, but we have now put a second video on the leftberlin.com, which is running live, but it will stay there. So We'll post the video links afterwards, and you can watch watch after. Just to bring more up to date, the next question, Hossam, is really what was the impact of 2011? We've had more recently uprisings in Tunisia, in Sudan, in Lebanon. Is there a continuum between what you did then and what's been happening in the last couple of years?
Yes, I do believe that there is an organic link between these two waves. One, this is a law of history. This is not something new. When a revolution happens in X country, this does not mean that, you know, the surrounding region is usually like an oasis of calmness and stability, and everything is going fine, and it's only this one country that has, you know, I mean, the uprising. Usually when an uprising takes place in a country, this means the whole region is already unstable. And there are different movements, social movements, and different forms of dissent on varying levels in the rest of the region. So, for example, if you look at the previous Arab Spring, which, you know, very few people talk about, is in the late 70s, 1970s. Egypt had the 1977 bread uprising. And this was around the same time that, you know, the following year, in 1978, Tunisia had an uprising led by the Federation of Trade Unions over there. There was the Iranian Revolution happening also at the time. There were mass protests happening in different Arab countries. On the global scale, you cannot separate 1977 in Egypt from the Portuguese Revolution in 1974, from the fall of fascism in Spain in 1975, from the defeat of the Americans the defeat of the Americans in Vietnam in 1975. I mean, all of these events are related at the end of the day. So when you talk about 2011, there were a number of Arab countries that have already been going through a process of dissent accumulation in the previous years, and they had reached already the level of revolutionary political maturity that the situation was ripe for an uprising. So you had an uprising in Tunisia, you had an uprising in Egypt, you had an uprising in Bahrain, you had an uprising in Syria, you had an uprising in Yemen. But this does not mean that the rest of the Arab countries or the countries in the region were all like stable and calm. Algeria had protests. Morocco had protests. In Jordan, they had protests. In Sudan, they had protests. But their protests were not big enough so as to be considered an uprising. Why is that? This is not something that is a defect, you know, I mean, of their society, and it's not something that they would be blamed for. It's basically the process of accumulation of dissent differs from one country to the other. So when Sudan broke out in a fully fledged revolution in December 2018, this was already preceded with some cycles of dissent. So they already had protests in 2011. They already had protests, a mini uprising in 2013. So 2018 was like the climax. And at the same time, the Sudanese activist community, those that I've known personally or I'm following on social media, you can always find that they were making references to countries of the first wave. They were comparing themselves to Egypt. They were comparing themselves to Tunisia. They were the Sudanese were waving Algerian flags because they believed rightly that they were in the same boat The slogans of the Egyptian uprising also traveled regionally, and you could hear them in the protests in Lebanon, in the protests in Iraq that broke out. So even when, in my view, the revolution in Sudan and the Algerian semi-uprising have been largely co-opted by now or besieged by the counter-revolution, that this is not the end of the story, and there will continue to be upheavals in the future. And this is not because it's X or Y or Z who is like instigating those uprisings or agitating for them using propaganda, but it's because there are real structural problems in the region. These structural problems could be reduced, in a very simplistic way to two problems, political repression and police brutality, and the lack of economic justice, or like the issue of social justice. So as long as these two structural problems continue, there will always be the objective conditions for a revolt until we manage to address those two problems by radical change.
Thank you for that. We don't want to exhaust you, so we'll start wrapping up now. I know you've been talking for ages, and you said so many things, and there's so many more things we could ask you, but we don't want you to lose your voice.
Thank you.
So I think we basically have two final questions. I'll ask one, and Phil will ask the last one. And the first one is just what is your position and what it now means to us in the West, both what happened 10 years ago and what's been happening in the last couple of years, and how we can respond to it, and what we can learn from it, and how you feel it's been affecting and reported on in the West, and basically how do you feel being also in Berlin about and seeing how it's being talked about, whether it is being talked about enough in your opinion, kind of the perspective of, I know that's a big question, you can answer whatever part you want from it. Just in terms of like being in Berlin and us being in Berlin also, and probably a lot of people watching from Berlin, kind of this kind of context of seeing it from now being in Europe.
There is so much that people here in Berlin and in Europe can do in order to help us back home. And by the process of helping us, you're helping yourselves also. Because such autocratic dictatorial regimes that exist in the Middle East and North Africa, they could not have continued to do, they would not have continued to remain in power. They could not have continued to engage in such horrific violations of human rights. They could not have been able to crush dissent in such a manner without the direct and indirect support of the West at the end of the day. Germany is one of the biggest trading partners with the Sisi regime, and also one of the biggest arms suppliers. France is also the same, the US and Britain. They are all doing business with dictators. So one thing that you can help us is to lobby your own governments as a start into stopping the military and the security aid to the autocratic regimes in the Arab world, and to lobby them into trying to secure the release of some political detainees. Pressure and lobbying sometimes work. But the thing that you can help us the most with is that actually you do a revolution in your own country. It's as simple as that. We are faced with a global system called capitalism. And this global system is the one behind the regimes that we have in the region, as well as the regimes you have here in the West, where you enjoy more freedoms, definitely, than us back home. But these freedoms were freedoms that were won by centuries of struggle by ordinary men and women of European societies, and they were fought for and paid for by blood on occasions. But at the same time, any form of struggle that you get engaged here in locally, on the long run helps us back home. Even if they were simply local struggles over garbage, over the environment, over things that you might consider trivial. But any reforms you manage to grab from that system, any attempt to make your governments much more accountable for their actions domestically and abroad, directly helped us back home. Of course, when I'm here in Berlin and I'm looking back, I mean, there were times where definitely it's very tempting to get depressed over where were we and what we ended up with 10 years later. But at the same time, I think depression is a luxury at this point. The planet is concretely threatened. Our existence as a human race, not just, I mean, in Egypt, but everywhere, is on the verge and on the brink of massive dangers and threats to the environment. And at the same time, with all of these crazy rulers that we have in around the world, starting from the White House itself all the way to Egypt, they are militarized. They do not hesitate about killing their own people if they felt threatened when it comes to their rule. So we have to organize. We should not feel depressed or demoralized, and we should try to maintain our activism even at the minimalist level, so that at least when the tide changes, there would be a nucleus that can expand into a snowball with the snowball effect, and revive once again the tradition of street activism back in our countries.
Thanks, Hossam. One very last question. After Hossam's speech, we've got a couple of announcements, so stay around. But it was 10 years ago. It was 1,000 miles ago. And sometimes people look at Syria today or look at Egypt today and say the Arab Spring, the uprisings failed. Was it worth it?
Yes, of course it was worth it. I mean, the reason why we are in a bleak situation today is not because of the uprisings. It's not because of the revolutions. It's because of the counter revolutions. Those revolutions which broke out were inevitable. The situation could not have continued with the same weight as they were. And when revolutions get defeated, the outcome is usually taking society back to square zero, as I was saying earlier. Those revolutions were worth it because they showed us that another world is possible. These revolutions were worth it because we have learned lessons from those revolutions. And next time an uprising happens, hopefully we will be able to avoid those mistakes and create an alternative, a different society that we deserve. We deserve to live as human beings in dignity, freely. We should not be worried about police torture. We should not be worried about starving children while we have the economic abundance to feed everyone. We should not feel worried about pandemics or health situations while we have reached a level of technology that can take care of the entire planet and all of its inhabitants. But the problem is that we live under a system that is geared by profit and which is controlled by a bunch of greedy, selfish billionaires. We need to change that, not just in Egypt, but across the planet.
Thank you, Hossam. As Hannah said earlier, we can talk for hours longer about this, but you deserve a pause as well. Sorry to everyone for the technical problems halfway through. We hope it will be all available to watch. A couple of final announcements from me. I'm not sure if Hannah would like to say something. Tomorrow, Sudan Uprising are organising a meeting. Let's talk about the EU's borders. In Africa, we doubly recommend that this is organised. Partly, they postponed this event so that people could come to this one. But it's looking to be a very good meeting. You can find that on the Sudan Uprising homepage, and we paste a link on our Facebook page as well. We have we have monthly meetings. Next month is going to be on gentrification. Migrants responsible for gentrification, what can we do to stop it? In a couple of months, there's going to be a meeting on discussing Palestine in Germany, which is going to be very interesting for people here. In September, we have a summer camp where everyone's invited. You've got plenty of time to find more information. To find more about who we are and what we do, you can either look at the website, theleftberlin.com, or you can, on this page, look at the Ask a Question button, bottom right, and send a question over there. Maybe, Hannah, you want to say something about the action on Saturday, organised by Polish socialists and feminists?
Yes, just quickly also about the Left Berlin or Die Linke Internationals, that we are also on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and you should follow us on there. You probably are on somewhere if you're already watching this, but if not, then do. And then we keep people informed about what's going on in Berlin and also around wherever around the world. And yes, just a quick plug for an action on Saturday, which is a Polish collective called Constellation Liberation or Co-Liberation is doing a solidarity action with the recent effective abortion ban in Poland, and will be collecting either donations in the form of either the morning after pill or money towards buying morning after pills, which will then transport to Poland. And this is happening in Hermannplatz this Saturday, 13th of February at 12:30 p.m. So just after midday, I mean. So please do come along and support that. And I just also wanted to say a huge thank you to Hossam for his insights and his input and for his patience with our technical issues. But it was really great to have you here tonight and give us such a very thorough, very thought-provoking talk, basically, because you were by yourself. So thank you so much. And also I hope you can take a bit of a rest from talking now.
Thank you.